The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
Hello, Tits Out Brigade. Before we start the episode, I have a big announcement to make. I'm going on a trip. I'm going to be in England and I'm going to be in Scotland to research my book that I'm writing. Did you hear? I'm writing a book about Caroline of Brunswick. Anyway, while I'm there, I know that some of you live in those places, and so I have penciled in some time to meet up with Tits Out Brigade members in those cities, the cities being Edinburgh, Scotland, and London, England. So we'll be meeting in Edinburgh, Scotland on Wednesday, August 21st, and in London, England on Wednesday, August 28th. Details are still being figured out, partially because I don't know how many of you are going to be there, which will mean where we meet or not, but it's going to be something like we'll meet somewhere in a public open space and like walk around looking at some oldie-timey things, is my hope. Anyway, details are still being figured out. And if you want to take part, let me know. Go to vulgarhistory.com/meetup, vulgarhistory.com/meetup, and fill in the form for updates. This is the first ever Tits Out Brigade meetups, and I'm really excited to make this happen. So yeah, vulgarhistory.com/meetup to sign up for updates and to kind of RSVP, so I know how many people to expect. Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is part 2 of our discussion of Peggy Shippen, who is, as was described to me by one of you who sent me a message, excited that we're talking about her. She's the original, the OG, scandalous lady of American Revolution era. And also, as a few of you have told me, she does appear as a character in a miniseries that was called Turn, Washington's Spies, which I haven't watched, but which seems like it's kind of like the American Revolution, but what if everyone was really hot? And what's crucial about this is that, well, first of all, Necia Solo plays Peggy Shippen. She was on Lost Girl, a Canadian lesbian show that I enjoyed. She's a cool person, a very cool looking person. And I feel like Peggy Shippen would have been in good hands with her portrayal. But also, John Andre is on the show, the character who, I haven't done a recap at all of last week, but I feel like if you're jumping into part 2 of Peggy Shippen, welcome. Last time we talked about her, she's trying to live her brat summer And then it all got pretty derailed when she married Benedict Arnold, and everything got really fucked up. She ended up being a spy, kind of against her will. She's a teen mom living in the woods. But the shining light in this whole story of dirtbags is John Andre, hot British spy John Andre. We're going to talk about him a lot more in this episode. And I was really happy that the defining feature of his portrayal on the show Turn, Washington Spies, is that he was hot. And I was just really gratified to see that because talking about him, I just felt like he was hot. And so I'm glad that the makers of that show felt that as well. And that is how he can be remembered now. Also, we're talking about Philadelphia. There's a lot of Philly in the episode. And this week, Philadelphia really, really, the way that people talk about Philadelphia now, like I think it's a city that as long as it's been around, it seems like it's been known for a citizenship, a population that is just like they keep their pots and pans right beside the door. Like they're ready 24 hours a day to riot if needed. And we got some of that in this week's episode. I feel like Gritty, the beloved mascot of Philadelphia, I think it's of the Philadelphia hockey team, but I feel like it's of Philadelphia in general, the big orange, like sort of Muppet googly-eyed guy. I feel like Gritty, the spirit of Gritty was definitely around in a lot of the stuff we're talking about this episode. Anyway, Peggy Shippen Part 2. Take it away, me. Anyway, and she knew her job was to help him, and she had to seem like a cute wife and use her like hotness to distract people and make him seem less suspicious. And so one night, she had quite a lot of work to do because Benedict Arnold, again, terrible at being a spy. So they were having dinner, like a dinner party one night, and one of the guests was a person who was like a suspected loyalist. And then Benedict Arnold was being like weirdly friendly with him, and people are like, why is Benedict Arnold being so friendly with that suspected loyalist? Is he like a spy? They were already thinking. And then a messenger arrived at the door with a sealed letter, which Benedict Arnold unsealed and read, not out loud, although you'd think he would be dumb enough to do that. He like looked at the letter in front of everybody and he got all shifty-eyed, and then he like shoved the letter in his pocket. He's like, nope, nothing to see here. Don't worry about what that letter just said. And then he and some other guys left, leaving Peggy behind, like jittery and nervous. And like, this is just kind of, she's doing her best, but she is still, an 18-year-old new mom married to a spy who is a bad spy who just did some bad spy stuff in front of other people. Anyway, so she was left behind and she started chatting, quote, hysterically. Like she just started babbling, really, just like, oh, what's Benedict Arnold doing? I don't know. Anyway, like, did you see the new episode of The Housewives? Oh, it was great. And so people are like, Peggy is like, seems nervous. She, just in terms of people to be a spy couple, neither of them seem fundamentally suited to that life. Like they're not like that show with Carrie Russell and her husband where they were like Russian spies. That's not the vibe of these two. Yeah, so Benedict Arnold just kept being the most obvious worst spy in various ways. John Andre is just like, oh my God, like this guy is a terrible spy. So there's a whole thing where Benedict Arnold had drawn like maps of West Point and what it looked like to get to the British. The British would know how to better invade. And then he met under cover of darkness with John Andre, hot violin spy. And like they met alongside the bank of the river, and then Benedict Arnold was like, hey, I think I should be paid more money about my spy work. And John Andre is like, no, like, can I have the maps or whatever? And they argued about this. Like it was nighttime when they met, like 2 a.m. or something. And they kept talking until like dawn broke. And they're like, okay, we need to like stop doing this because someone's going to see us because we're bad spies. Anyway, ultimately, Benedict Arnold did give these maps and information on West Point to John Andre, who put these things in his boots. And there's a whole thing where John Andre, he showed up and he was wearing his like red coat, like British Army outfit, which is like, okay, interesting choice. But then they're like, no, you should wear like a disguise. You should go in civilian clothes to deliver these to the British Army because then you'll be less suspicious or something. But again, I love you, John Andre, but you are also not a good spy. Map drawing is your skill set, party planning. But anyway, so things are very much on edge. Is there a play about this weekend? Because, it's all in one room in one house and just like everyone is getting increasingly unhinged. So the day started, Benedict Arnold is back at home and he got into screaming argument with somebody about the price of butter. And then some guests came by who were the Marquis de Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton from the musical Hamilton, and George W. Like they're George W.'s friends, and George W. came as well. And what had happened, the news they were coming there to share, is that John Andre, so he'd gone off in his like civilian clothes with the maps and stuff, and then he was caught by someone, and he was like, oh, I think these guys are probably loyalists. So he's like, hey, are you guys also loyal to the British Crown or whatever? And then the guys were like, no, actually, we're patriots. Like, what's going on? And then they saw that he had papers in his boots and they took them out, but those guys couldn't read. So at first it was fine, but then they like brought him in, and then it was discovered that these were maps of West Point. And so Benedict Arnold, not necessarily compromised at this point, but like John Andre arrested. And so George W., Lafayette, and Alexander Hamilton came by to be like, whoa, man, did you know that that guy, John Andre, the party planner, was just caught with these maps? And Benedict Arnold was like, wow, crazy news. I'm just going to go to West Point and see you all later. And he just like pieces out before they know that he's involved. Peggy, he had time to talk to Peggy before he like made his exit. And so Peggy is left behind. And we know fundamentally, like I would probably be similar. She's just like not good under pressure. So she's just like, okay, what are we going to do? So she burned his like secret spy letters in the bedroom fireplace. And then she's like, what? How are we going to handle this? Peggy, what are we going to do? And so this is like one of the most famous things she did. There's an episode of Drunk History about her doing this. And what she did was she's like, I'm going to pretend like I just found out Benedict Arnold is a spy and I'm now insane. That news made me go insane and have a nervous breakdown. So, and this works because like there was recently that thing where she was just like babbling incoherently. Like she had that like screaming fit at that party one time when she heard news about his job. Like she's known for being a person who has fits. And so she's just like, I'm just going to go for it. So she just started screaming. Her hair is disheveled. She like tore out her clothes. She was raving. And all the men in the house were like, oh man, what's wrong with Peggy Shippen? It seems like she's going through some emotional distress. And they were so distracted helping her that Benedict Arnold was able to escape. Meanwhile, George W. is like, why? Like he was like, meet you at West Point. And George W. goes there and he's like, why isn't Benedict Arnold here? Hamilton and Lafayette told him about the betrayal, like the fact that like he had been in league with John Andre and that they were going to try and have the British seize West Point. George W. It's his turn now. Lots of, pressures are high on all sides. He freaks out. He's yelling like, go and catch Benedict Arnold. But our boy, Benedict Arnold, was already on a prearranged ship out of town, headed to British-controlled New York City. Meanwhile, Peggy Shippen is just like kept like playing up the part of like hysterical person, which also I think partially she was doing because that meant like if I seem like this makes her seem like not implicated. It makes it seem like she didn't know that Benedict Arnold was doing this. And in fact, George W., Hamilton, and Lafayette came out to visit her and they're like, oh wow, she has actually lost her mind. Like we're not suspicious of her whatsoever. Like this is how we would assume a wife would react to learning her husband is a traitor. And because everyone kind of loves Peggy, Hamilton was just like, he wrote in the thing, he's like, I'm so mad that Benedict Arnold betrayed America, but I'm even more mad that he betrayed Peggy, his lovely teenage wife. Anyway, so she's just left there with baby Nettie. Benedict Arnold has gone to New York and she's just like, what am I going to do? It's a real Mary Queen of Scots deciding between France and England moment for her. She's like, do I go to New York to be with my husband, or do I go back to Philadelphia to be with my parents? And eventually she's like, I'm going to go back to Philadelphia to be with my parents. And on the way there, she's taking the Benedict Arnold carriage, which people recognized and they like jeered and called out at it because he was already like, everyone had found out that he was a traitor and everyone hated him. People didn't need a lot of reason. Everyone already hated him, but now they also hated him for being a traitor. And I don't know how different carriages can look from each other, but I picture that the Benedict Arnold carriage was covered with, like decals, like a car when it's advertising a real estate company or something. Anyway, so it took a while to get from West Point to Philadelphia. So she had a baby with her. So like at night she would stop at friends' houses. One of the places where she spent a night was with Theodosia Prevost, who is the Theodosia from the song Theodosia from Hamilton. She's like a married woman who Aaron Burr was in love with, and then later he married. So allegedly, according to Theodosia's later husband, Aaron Burr, from the musical Hamilton, allegedly, Peggy confided to Theodosia that she had been faking being upset and she was tired of having to perform all the time, and that she had corresponded with John Andre, which some of this is maybe true, but also allegedly Aaron Burr had there's a whole thing about like, did Aaron Burr at one point try to seduce Peggy and she turned him down, so Aaron Burr was mad at Peggy. I don't know. Anyway, I just wanted to include that because it's Hamilton adjacent content. Anyway, back in Philadelphia, the newspapers were just like, this is amazing. This is like even bigger than Scandoval. This is like the biggest, like, we're going to sell so many newspapers talking about the story. One of John Andre's letters to Peggy was discovered, the one where he was like, hey, let's talk about fabrics and stuff and nothing suspicious. Like, there was nothing suspicious in the letter, but the fact that he had written a letter to her made her seem like she was involved. Her family, her powerful family, the Shippens, were like, no, that was just a letter about fabric. And this is called the Millinery Letter. And it's like, if you read about Peggy Shippen, this comes up a lot. It's sort of the casket letters of the story. This is like before she got there. So Philadelphia, like, again, the vibe is so similar to those like sports things where people in Philadelphia flood the streets and just like climb the poles. Like, this is their Philadelphia itself just causes people to behave this way. So there was this sort of impromptu, not so impromptu actually, like just like we hate Benedict Arnold parade. So a drum summoned Philadelphia residents to the streets where some arts and crafts people, again, I would say John Andre, except he's currently under arrest and he was actually on the same side. Some John Andre-like arts and crafts person has created a dummy version effigy of Benedict Arnold, which is now parading through the streets in a wagon. So this dummy, this is very artistic, had two faces. It held a mask in its right hand. In the left hand, the figure clutched a message from Satan announcing his completion of mischief. Behind the dummy stood Satan, shaking a bag of money at the general's left ear and grasping a pitchfork poised to drive the traitor into hell. So they paraded this around and then later set it on fire. So quite a thing that some very artistic person came up with. But also, this gets into the whole thing about the American founding fathers and how like the Declaration of Independence is like, it has the authority of like the Bible or God, like the concept that the founding of America was like divine somehow, like God wanted that to happen, to the extent that Benedict Arnold is now equated with Satan. Like, betraying America is the same as like betraying Jesus, is the vibe. And this happened right away. But I guess tensions were already high and the city of Philadelphia already kind of hated him. And then, just like in that final scene in the movie Cruel Intentions, so people are going through Benedict Arnold's stuff, his house, like, because he like lived in Philadelphia. So among his letters, they found a letter from Peggy to him. And this letter, she's being sort of like catty and bitchy and talking about how the other women at a concert, like their outfits weren't as cute as her outfit or whatever. And then this was published in the newspaper and it's like, Peggy is a bitch. Like, look at her writing this mean girl letter. She's not this sweet young victim. She's actually this like mean girl. And it's like, yes, she was. But also publishing that as a newspaper. And also it's like her private letter. It's like showing somebody's DMs. It's just like, well, this was intended. She was just being silly and writing some like bitchy stuff to her husband. She's also at the time 17. Anyway, so Peggy goes back to her parents' home and she goes into kind of a stupor. And I don't want to be like her various psychological experiences are invalid. Like the time, like her throwing a tantrum to get what she wants from her dad is a thing. But her like having these like serious emotional responses to these events is like, she's an emotional person. Maybe she wouldn't have been living a more normal life, but this is quite a series of situations she's been in since the day she got married. So she just kind of went into a stupor. Understandable. Like if it was today, she'd go to her parents' house and just like stay in her pajamas all day, just like, you know, watching Friends episodes and just eating Doritos. Like she's just like, what the fuck is my life? I used to be this hot, young, like society girl. And now like there's an effigy of my husband with Satan. Like what is happening? To the confusion of everybody, she remained loyal to Benedict Arnold. She did not turn away from him. She still kept supporting him. She still, when he wrote her a letter, she would respond to it. And her family were like, really? Peggy, really? And then Emma Roberts and the Supreme Executive Council kicked her out of Philadelphia. They, in fact, wrote a letter being like, you can't live here, lady. Her being there was a public danger to others. And so she's like, I guess I'm going to go to New York City. So she took her baby Nettie, tearfully bid farewell to her beloved dad, who still loved her as his favorite, and went off to NYC. But I know you're wondering what happened to John Andre. Now, John Andre, I forget if I said this, but in my survey, only 12.6% of the 300 Americans surveyed had heard of John Andre. So I need to let you know what happens to him because it's interesting. So he was caught and ordered to be hanged as a traitor, which is interesting because how was he a traitor when he was actually a British person just doing British? Like he wasn't a traitor. Like he was actually always on one side, which was the British side. Anyway, so even before his execution, though, he had aroused the sympathy of British and American people because what I just said, it's kind of like, well, he's just kind of like doing his thing. Like he's just being a British soldier, and that's what he did. But he was ordered to be hanged in Tappan, New York. If anyone has been there or lives there, shout out to Tappan, New York. So he walked to the gallows. He was watched by apparently many sobbing women, one of whom apparently gave him a peach. And when he was hanged, that peach later grew into a tree above his grave. For there was a peach tree above his grave. And then he was buried where he was hanged, basically in Tappan, New York, below the site of his hanging. And this tree and this hymn is mentioned in the story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, which is a story with Ichabod Crane. And they talk about this tree was haunted by John Andre in that story, apparently. Later on, years and years from now, we've got a lot more episode to go, but when Peggy died and her children were going among her belongings, they found among her belongings the locket that John Andre had given her with a lock of his hair inside. So she was a good friend to him. John Andre became a romantic hero in England because, you know, the story of him being a spy and then being executed, but also he was like hot and like threw parties. So people in England were like, you know what? Fuck you, America. You killed our cool guy. So a tomb to his memory was erected 2 years later in London, in Westminster Abbey. If I ever get to Westminster Abbey, the number of people I've talked about on this podcast who have tombs there, like I'm going to have to spend a day seeing them all. The tomb was paid for by the person who was the king at this time, George III, aka Farmer George from Queen Charlotte, a Bridgerton story. And the tomb, it's one of those carved things with like scenes on it. And it's like scenes of like George Washington and like a woman crying and like just showing John Andre being a hero. 40 years after that, his remains were at the request of the royal family. His remains were moved from America because he was buried in Tappan. His remains were moved to London, and then so now he's buried in Westminster Abbey as well. And there's like a little tile on the floor showing it says like Major Andre, I think. And when they went to dig him up after this, on the banks of the Hudson River, the roots of the peach tree had pierced the coffin. And so the peach tree was uprooted and replanted in the King's Garden behind Carlton House in London. John Andre is often remembered favorably by historians as a man of honor, like unlike, for instance, Benedict Arnold. John Andre was always loyal to the one side. Several prominent U.S. leaders of the time, including Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette, did not agree with him being hanged. In Tappan in 1879, so like 100 years later, on the site of his hanging, a monument was erected. And on the monument are lines from George W., which says, quote, "He was more unfortunate than criminal, an accomplished man and a gallant officer." So I wanted to tell you that to wrap up the story of John Andre, a person who I had not heard of, and most of you had also not heard of. Only 12.6% of Americans surveyed had heard of him. He just seemed like a cool guy. He's got a bit of David Rizzio vibes about him. And like David Rizzio, died very young. But also, let's just compare him to Benedict Arnold. John Andre, cool guy. Benedict Arnold, you know, I came into this episode, I'm like, okay, Peggy Shippen. I know she's the wife of Benedict Arnold. I vaguely thought, like, I think she was maybe a spy. I think I saw this on Drunk History. And I was like, you know, these people get a bad rap. Like Benedict Arnold, like I know he's like famous. His name is synonymous in the US with just being a traitor. I think I'd first heard about him. There's an episode of my favorite show, Murder, She Wrote, called, I think, Benedict Arnold Slept Here, where there's a whole thing about a house where he apparently slept at one point. And anyway, from that episode, and also I think he appears maybe in Timeless, the late lamented time travel TV show that used to be on NBC. I think he was involved in that. So I just kind of had this vibe of like Benedict Arnold, oh, he sucks. He's a traitor. But then it's like, oh, but is this just like it's just history being shared where it's like George W. was and Thomas Jefferson were heroes. And so that means Benedict Arnold has to suck also. But I'm here to tell you, Benedict Arnold was a traitor and also a shitty person. Peggy, just along for the ride, in my opinion. So anyway, 5 days after the execution of John Andre, Benedict Arnold wrote a letter to the editor because he's the sort of guy, and this, the whole newspapers of it all, like, of course, he wrote a letter to the editor of a New York City newspaper where he's just like, blah, 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 you're all assholes, I'm great, John Andre shouldn't have been killed, blah, blah. He'd now officially switched sides. He was now getting a salary as a British Army person, and the salary was enough to pay for him to live in a townhouse. Here's, I've got some sights if you're in New York City, things you can see. He lived at 3 Broadway. Several efforts were made to kidnap him because he was the most hated person in America. He had been a member of the Connecticut Freemasons, because I think he's from Connecticut. They blotted his name from their list of members. Even the Freemasons were just like, fuck this guy. So residents of his hometown went to the graveyard or the cemetery, and they smashed up the grave markers of his father and his infant brother who had been buried there. And in various cities, other people did their own version of Benedict Arnold, Satan effigies to parade through the streets and burn. He had been brought to Philadelphia to sort of bring everyone together to try and make the two sides coexist. But I think where he did make more, he had been brought to Philadelphia to try and make everyone be sort of on Team George W. And in fact, I think he did bring everyone together in America in hatred of him. I think both sides hated him, basically. Peggy Shippen. Don't forget about her. She is by now 20 years old. She's had quite an action-packed year and a half of married life. But she's in New York City, and she's like, okay, who are the hot girls? Where are the hot nightclubs? Let me get my tits out and try and improve my husband's reputation by being hot. So she was trying to be sort of a goodwill ambassador for her husband's reputation, which was toxic. She also became pregnant again. So Benedict Arnold, he has this army job for the Brits. And so because he's experienced being a military guy, so he was given a job to lead some British soldiers in Virginia, which led to a situation that maybe people in Virginia are familiar with. So at this time, Thomas Jefferson, who I want to say, of everybody on my list of people, Thomas Jefferson, 99.7% of Americans surveyed are familiar with Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, Thomas Jefferson at this point is the governor. And so Benedict Arnold led some troops in Virginia. He had an argument with Thomas Jefferson about tobacco crops. And this whole thing wrapped up with Benedict Arnold vengefully ordering the burning of the city of Richmond, in which lots of people died. So, yeah, so again, it's just the American Revolution not settled. It still seems like the British could win it. But Benedict Arnold started being bored. He's I want a better job. I want more money. And so he went back to New York City and stopped leading troops. So he had been away for 6 months doing all this stuff, burning Richmond, etc. And during which time Peggy, away from him, now entering her adulthood era, she thrived. She was very pregnant, and which I just mentioned because she didn't hide. She wasn't having serious issues where she had hide away in the house or whatever. She was just I'm pregnant, I got my tits out, and let's just meet the other hot young socialites. So she became the it girl belle of society now in New York City as well. She had a second baby, a son named James Robertson. Benedict Arnold took another job where he was leading another battle scenario. One thing led to another, and in this one, a ship filled with gunpowder exploded due to his negligence, which made everybody on every side of this war mad at him. So kind of, yeah, Hepburn is here. What are your thoughts on Benedict Arnold? No one liked him. I appreciate that at the time people hated him, because sometimes there's a thing after the fact, but I just someone who him is shitty. In his lifetime, he knew he was hated. And do you remember so much of this started where he was concerned about his reputation? And that's why he's I want a court martial and stuff, where it's just his reputation could not be worse. Hashtag quoting from Taylor Swift. So his whole life is a reputation era, Benedict Arnold. Anyway, so eventually the British surrendered in 1781, and that was the end of the American Revolution, more or less. So Team George W. had won, and Benedict Arnold and Peggy were let's leave the country. Everyone on this continent hates us. Benedict, everyone loved Peggy. And so they decided to go to London, England. So they sailed over on separate ships. Peggy was on a more luxurious, comfortable ship with their young children. Benedict Arnold was on a more military ship, and this was good that they were separate because Benedict Arnold's ship was chased by privateers trying to kidnap him. He had to do a switcheroo, change ships, and anyway, eventually he got away. So they came over to London, England, and they went to live. Here's people in London, some sights you can see. They lived in a handsome 5-story townhouse in Portman Square, which is sort of an area where other American loyalists had moved, people who had lived in America for a while, sided with the British, and then fled. The rich ones went to London to live in Portman Square. So he was introduced to King George III, aka Farmer George from Queen Charlotte, a Bridgerton story. And he actually got a private meeting with him, followed by a stroll through St. James Park with the king and his son, the Prince of Wales, aka Prinny, aka the future husband of Caroline of Brunswick. So, who was 18 or 19 years old at this point, Prinny. So Peggy arrived, and right away, everyone's just she's great. We like her. She was feted as the most beautiful woman in England. She was introduced at court. She met Queen Charlotte from Queen Charlotte Bridgerton story, except not her, the actual boring one. And Queen Charlotte, who, was sort of dressed out of fashion and was boring. You'd think she'd be oh, I don't know about this tits out lady, but even she loved Peggy. Peggy was great. She took a liking to her. She gave an annuity, which is sort of a salary of £100 a year to Peggy for the maintenance of her children, those she had and those which were yet to be born. George III also issued a pension on Peggy's behalf, which may be proof that she had done spy work, because there's a whole thing about was she a spy or was she just married to a spy? But the fact that she got a pension from the government means she probably did something he was grateful for. Anyway, so Peggy's great. Everyone loves Peggy. But as per usual, nobody likes Benedict Arnold. One guy said, quote, Peggy was an admirable woman, and was her husband dead, she would be much noticed. So tragically, if you want to hang out with Peggy, Benedict comes along too. Unfortunate. So Benedict Arnold, he's just I need some jobs and money. So he applied for a position with the East India Company, but he was rejected for that job because the person who was doing the hiring was an American loyalist. Or no, so that's on his same team, but they're just we don't like you, Benedict Arnold. Even in England, people hated him for his disloyalty. So even though he'd switched to their side, they didn't like that he had switched sides. But also, on top of that, he just had an unpleasant personality. And now for a quick advertising break.
As someone who enjoys trying out different makeup looks but doesn't wear a ton on a daily basis, I like to focus on making sure I have high quality staples. And regardless of your makeup routine, you've probably seen Thrive Cosmetics Viral Tubing Mascara. I've certainly seen it everywhere. It's in that turquoise tube, and it's become my go-to for mascara because it doesn't clump or smudge, and it comes off really easily with just water. So that mascara, along with all of Thrive Cosmetics beauty products, are certified 100% vegan and cruelty-free. Their bestsellers have thousands of 5-star reviews, and it's easy to see why. Their products are great. I love a multi-purpose makeup product, and their brilliant eye brightener is perfect to use as eyeliner, eyeshadow, even highlighter. I'd recommend using shade Stella for that. They all have a shimmer, and Stella is this really pretty champagne color that looks great on a variety of skin tones. Something I also didn't know from all the mascara videos I saw is that for every product sold, Thrive Cosmetics donates either that same product, another product that's needed more, or a monetary donation towards 8 major causes, including those impacted by cancer, domestic abuse, and veteran and education organizations. So refresh your everyday look with Thrive Cosmetics. It's beauty that gives back. Right now, you can get an exclusive 20% off your first order at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/thrive for 20% off your first order. As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. She gave birth a daughter named Margaret, who died after 7 months. At the time the baby Margaret died, she was already pregnant again. She's 22 by this point, going on her 4th pregnancy, and everyone still loves her. One person said she was more noticed and more liked than any American that ever came over. She's visited by people of the first rank and invited to all their houses. So this next child was named George. He died shortly after birth. Benedict Arnold kept petitioning for more money from the government. And finally, he's like, I'm not going to get a government job or money, so I'm just going to establish my own business, which is going to be international trade, which for him was so. After the American Revolution, people who had been loyal to Britain left America. So some of them went to London, like the Benedict, or like the Arnolds did. And a lot of them went north to Canada, specifically to what is now the province of New Brunswick. So he was like, I'm going to go and sell imported goods to the loyalists in New Brunswick. Was his plan. Peggy, like again, she's pregnant, but like when is she not? She's just like getting tired of his like get rich quick schemes. Her brother-in-law came to visit at one point because, we know what she was thinking because there's a lot of her letters exist back to her family. And I think she was so upset that they were like, let's send somebody. By the way, her family referred to Benedict Arnold as that infernal villain. They hated him and they were mystified that she was standing by her man. Anyway, her brother-in-law came to visit and found she seemed relatively content. She gave birth to a daughter named Sophia, and the brother stuck around just to make sure Sophia was okay before leaving. And Benedict Arnold went to New Brunswick to start his new business. And when I got to this part of the story, I was just like, wow, New Brunswick. New Brunswick is one of the Canadian provinces, and it's the setting of, if you watch the show on the Hallmark Channel, The Way Home, the time travel show with the pawn. But New Brunswick doesn't get a lot of attention or love. There's a show that they film there where people competitively make sandcastles. Lots of stuff happens there. There's a really high tide and really low tide or something. Anyway, I'm just happy for New Brunswick to be involved in a story because it's not often mentioned in things. The other Canadian provinces get a lot more attention. Anyway, so she didn't hear from him for months. So she's just like, is he alive? Is he dead? What has happened to my horrible husband? And the reason she hadn't heard from him was because towards the end of the Atlantic crossing, he suffered another attack of gout and he fell ill. And so he had to stick around in Halifax, Nova Scotia. When I came to that, I was just like, what? Because I'm sure I've said this on the podcast before, but just so listeners know, that's where I'm from. I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm like, Benedict Arnold was in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So Halifax, Nova Scotia at this point was really a British garrison city. So I guess it makes sense he was there, but like, wow, Halifax, Nova Scotia, shout out. So he couldn't make the rest of the trip himself. He had to hire a pilot and a captain to go the rest of the way on his behalf. And then the ship that those guys were in got stuck, I guess, in like the famous New Brunswick tidal changes. And then scavengers stole a bunch of the goods they're going to sell. So just like this whole thing not going well. Eventually, Benedict Arnold felt better after his attack of gout, and he went headed to New Brunswick because that one ship, they lost most of those goods, but he had other goods to sell. So basically, he's just like a scammer. He's just like, okay, here's my latest gift. Let's just sell stuff too. He bought land in New Brunswick to sell to the loyalists. He was selling them imported British goods. I don't know if you have a store like this where you live. If you're not in England, English people might find this interesting. Sometimes there's stores that are British stuff, like a store that sells imported candy and tea and stuff for British people who move to other countries. Actually, where I live in Saskatoon, Canada, there's a new store that sells American stuff. So for people who want to get imported American things, for instance, from that American store, you can buy Dolly Parton cake mix. Anyway, so he was just starting British goods for loyalist people in New Brunswick business. So 1,000,000 hours ago, I mentioned he had 3 sons before he married Peggy. And so those 3 sons now adults. And he invited them to come up from Connecticut to help him out with this New Brunswick business. He finally wrote back to Peggy being like, hey, guess what? I'm alive. And you and our children should come here to New Brunswick as well. Peggy Shippen, somehow pregnant again. They must have visited at some point. I guess he left her pregnant. Anyway, so there's no doubt about who is the father of these children. So I guess he didn't write to her for a while, and then he came back to visit her, knocked her up, left again, is what happened. Anyway, so she's like, I don't want to go there. But Benedict Arnold was like, well, if you come to New Brunswick, that's practically Philadelphia, so you can go and visit your family. So she's like, okay. So in the last weeks of her pregnancy, she got on an Atlantic ship. She arrived in New Brunswick. She gave birth 6 weeks after arriving in St. John. And they named the son George after the King of England. So in St. John. And these are some if, listeners in New Brunswick, here's some sites you can visit. They lived on the corner of King and Cross Street, which is now Canterbury Street. Things were not great for them there because all other North American British colonies at this time, there was a recession due to the ongoing revolutions and things. Peggy was on her own a lot with her increasing amount of very young children, although she did have help from Benedict Arnold's sister, the plain-dressed Hannah, who was on the scene to help out. I guess she came up with the adult sons as well. Peggy Shippen, if we're keeping track, is now 29 years old. And she's still gorgeous, popular. She rallies. She has this real resiliency and ability to be like, this sucks, but you know what? I'm gonna see it through. She hosted dinners, attended galas. She found some gal pals to hang out with. And then July 11th of whatever year this is, Benedict Arnold's warehouse went up in flames. His youngest 2 sons had been sleeping in the warehouse because they slept in the office as guards. They were both badly burned and barely escaped with their lives. And Benedict Arnold was like, okay, so I want to get money back from the insurance company. And the insurance company was like, this is obviously arson fraud, and you just burned down your own business with your sons inside of it to get money. One of the people saying that was his business partner. So then Benedict Arnold accused his business partner of slander. The insurance company was like, we're just going to see how this goes. So he's in the midst of another self-made drama. I don't know if he burned down the warehouse himself or if just someone who hated him did that. But either way, I blame him. And Peggy was like, I'm just going to go visit my family in Philadelphia. Now, goodbye. So her mother had recently had a stroke, which was another reason why this was really important to her and why she decided to do this, even though she was very pregnant, the Atlantic crossing. So she took her youngest baby, little George, as well as an enslaved Black woman. So note to listeners, there have been enslaved Black people throughout this whole saga because these are wealthy white people in America at that time, and they all had enslaved Black people with them. So Peggy went to hang out with her family, but the people in Philadelphia, if you will recall, the people of Philadelphia had done things like dedicate the time to make a life-size paper mache dummy of Benedict Arnold and the devil, a day after he was caught for being a traitor. They're not happy she's back because they really hate Benedict. The whole country of America seemed to be founded on the principle of we all hate Benedict Arnold and she's his wife. But she loved seeing her family. She hadn't seen them for even, I don't even know, 10 years. And seeing them made her even more sad to leave, which, relatable content. And so she went back to New Brunswick and she's like, can we go back to maybe England where people hate us less? And I have friends there. And Benedict Arnold was like, well, we can't because I'm in the middle of this like insurance scam trial. 18 months later, Supreme Court in Fredericton, New Brunswick decided that his partner was guilty of slander. I don't know about the insurance fraud though. Anyway, so Benedict Arnold had sued his business partner for slander. And he had said, I want £5,000, but the court was like, 20 shillings. So he was mad about this, and newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, because now all of England also hated him, just wrote scathing newspaper articles about how Benedict Arnold sucked, which were accurate newspaper articles. One night, soon after the trial, a mob appeared before his home, smashing windows and doors. And then somehow they had an effigy. People in this era were just real effigy makers. So they smashed his windows, the doors. Then they came into the house and they paraded through the house with an effigy of him that said traitor on it. Like Peggy and the children are home watching this all happen. And then there was a street riot that became so violent that soldiers had to intervene to calm things down. And they went back to England after that, leaving his sister and his burnt adult sons to manage his scam of a business. So back in London, so a duel happened. Rumors came out in the newspapers that Benedict Arnold had died in a duel. Peggy was like, okay, no, he didn't die in a duel. Like she wrote a letter to, because her father wrote a letter, I guess, being like, hey, newspaper said your husband died in a duel. Like, I hope that's true. Is he dead? And Peggy's like, no, there was a duel. He didn't die. What had happened was some guy insulted Benedict Arnold, like everyone did every day. Benedict Arnold demanded an apology. And in fact, he wrote a template for the guy to sign, being like, I, fill in your name here, apologize to Benedict Arnold, signed name. The guy wouldn't sign the letter. And so then Benedict Arnold challenged him to a duel. And this is, the era of Hamilton, the musical, which also famously has duels in it. So they did a duel. They both had their, they went to a park, you stand back to back. They both had their seconds. Peggy stayed home, just being like, my husband is a nightmare in increasingly unhinged ways. What happened was Benedict Arnold fired first, but he missed. And the other guy was like, I dare you to shoot again. And Benedict Arnold was like, no, that's against the rules of duels. So neither of them died. And somehow, this situation made people appreciate Benedict Arnold for courage in dueling. Like the fact that he didn't shoot again when he could have made people be like, that was cool of him. So he was like, this is great. King George, can you pay me more money now that I'm popular? He also applied for military posts, but he didn't get more money. He didn't get the military posts, but just his reputation got 1 point better. So he's like, you know what I'm going to do? Again, I'm not getting money from the government. I'm going to go back to my roots of being a self-owned business grifter. And I'm going to sell 2 of my New Brunswick ships to fund a privateer, which is like a pirate, but legal. So he was going to fund a privateer vessel, which would attack the French. And he wanted to get into trade in the West Indies / the Caribbean region again. Peggy, who is pregnant, again, just if I don't say, just assume she always is. I was just like, are you fucking kidding me? Oh my God, can you please grow up? Yes, she was a child when they married, but now she is in her 30s and she's just fully aware of what a disaster this man is with his constant get rich quick schemes. So he was going to go to the Caribbean in March 1794, but then his departure was delayed because of the weather. And you know who arrived at around the same time due to the weather is the arrival of a ship of exiles. Rich people fleeing France from the Reign of Terror. So that is a connection to the overall season theme, Marie Antoinette, the French Revolution. This is all happening at the same time. I included that detail just to remind you, this is all happening at the same time. He did eventually, his ship was able to leave, the weather cleared. And so he went to trade English goods. So again, he's just opening up an English goods store in places where immigrant English people were living. So he's selling these in St. Kitts. And then he went on to the Guadeloupe island of Grande Terre, which the day he arrived was the French arrived and took it over, and he was captured and put on a prison ship. If he'd arrived 1 day earlier, that wouldn't have happened to him. So he is a shitty person who also has just very bad timing and luck. So he's in prison. Peggy doesn't know what's going on. 3 weeks later, from his being like put on a prison ship, John Knox vibes, Peggy gave birth again to a son that she named William Fitch, named after one of their neighbors in London. And then Benedict Arnold, I'll give him credit for this because this is pretty cool. So he bribed his guards on the prison ship and made a daring escape, which comprised of he squeezed through the cabin window of the prison ship, shimmied down a rope onto a raft, Mary Queen of Scots vibes, paddled through shark-infested waters to a small boat, which he rowed to a British ship. The captain of that ship was impressed by his moxie, I guess, and rewarded him with some new jobs, like I think an army job and also being like in charge of something in Guadeloupe for the British Army. So he stayed in Guadeloupe for a year, then returned to London, where Peggy, by now 35 years old, had become an invalid because of, like, she's always been, I would say, an anxious person. She's a person who feels emotions deeply. Like, again, just trying to parse out, when you read about her, there's a lot of stuff where it's like, oh, she would pitch a fit to get her way, where it's like, well, maybe she was actually that upset. Like, anyway. So all the stuff, like her husband went missing, she's having children all the time. He came back and found that she was basically bedridden because of her nerves, because of financial worries. Her mother had died in Philadelphia. Like she's 35 and having, I don't know, that's not quite quarter life crisis, but it's like midlife crisis. She's just like, peace out, like my brain, like let's just fuck everything. So Benedict Arnold, to his credit, was like, oh, I've ruined this woman's life. I'm going to try and help. So he took her to the baths in Cheltenham, to the ocean near Surrey. But one thing that did, I don't know if that helped, fresh air, whatever, but one event that did cheer her up was that her father sent a portrait of himself. And she loves her father so much, like she'd always been his favorite. And actually at around that same time, for the first time in one of her letters, she admitted for the first time that marrying Benedict Arnold had bankrupted her vitality and spirit. So this is part of where she's just having this real aha moment of just like, because, she was with him for so long and from a really young age, and everything was kind of like, well, who's going to win the war? Like maybe what we're doing is good. But now she's just like, oh no, this guy sucks. Fuck. Okay. So the years following this Guadeloupe adventure had been economically disastrous for Peggy and their 5 children. But Benedict Arnold continued to live like a wealthy man because that was what he did. He was, like so many people in this podcast, greatly in debt and terrible with money. So he moved the family into a new townhouse in Gloucester Place. Peggy was having migraines at this point as well. And he just kept proposing new get-rich-quick schemes, often involving privateers. He had a real thing for just like pirate life. And at one point, so their youngest daughter, Sophia, at one point she'd always been sort of like, her health was not great. And for a while, her legs became temporarily paralyzed, Sophia. And Peggy is just like, as a woman, she couldn't get a job. Like she couldn't do, like all she could do is like, marry well, but it's like she's already married to him, so she can't change what she's doing. She's just like, how are we going to provide for our 5 children? Our one daughter is really sick. She knew that she would be responsible for the children's future because her husband was useless. One of the issues she was worried about was paying for their education. So the oldest sons were 17 and 18. They'd nearly completed their education, planned to join the British Army. The other 3 still had years of schooling ahead, and she's just like, we have no money. My husband is terrible. And then his health, Benedict Arnold's health, suddenly got worse. Or just, I guess you could, I don't know. I'm sure he had the leg thing and gout and stuff, but just everything kind of got worse in late 1800, early 1801, which was reported in this thing I read as the effects of repeated gout, general dropsy, and disease in the lungs. He slipped into a coma. Peggy stayed by his side. When he woke up briefly from the coma, he apologized for his failures. Like, you know what? Credit for that, for not waking up and being like, everything I did was great. He's just like, oh, I really fucked up, didn't I? And then he died on June 14th, 1801. He was buried, or his gravesite was in St. Mary's, Battersea, in a crypt that was often used for American loyalists. And Peggy vowed to redeem his reputation. I mean, good luck, Peggy, but like, yikes. At least when he's dead, he can't make things worse. And this is where, like, there's the first pivot in her life where, or as I see it, like first they fled to New York and then London, and then like No, when they were at West Point, that's why I first was just like, oh, she's like stepping up, like in terms of just being a person who is strong and can resiliency. Like she sort of surprised many people when she was able to stick with Benedict through all that stuff, like the time on the run and everything. She was always sort of like, I don't know, energetically, is that the word? I don't, but she was just always like passionately trying to like improve their lot and to do things. And she like pivoted. Resiliency, I guess, is the word I just keep coming back to, like unexpected. And this is where, again, problematic heroine, Scarlett O'Hara comes to mind, where it's just like both of them were sort of just like teenage belles who were just kind of like not really thinking about what was happening politically around them until suddenly they were forced to reckon with that. And then both of them drew upon resources and a strength of character maybe they didn't know they had, and did what they could to support their family. So that's the vibe here. So this is another pivot. So she becomes a widow. Her husband is finally dead and she is free of him. But she's like, okay, like when he was alive, he was shitty and bankrupting them. But like at least she had a husband. Like being a single widow is a challenging time. And she's like, I will rise up to this challenge. And so she did. So a few weeks after his death, one of her friends wrote how impressed she was with Peggy's courage and fortitude. Like for a person who would often, she cried easily, you know, she had these sort of like fits or whatever, but like she's, you know, pulling herself through this. And after his death, Peggy learned the truth of their finances, which was that they were in incredible debt. So she immediately stopped spending as much. She started changed her lifestyle completely to just be like, I'm going to like balance out these books. But also from his will. So there's this thing, like one of the beneficiaries of his will is a young man in New Brunswick named John Sage. And so no one really knows who this guy was. Did Benedict Arnold father an illegitimate child during his time in New Brunswick? Like, did he have a mistress? Was the mother like maybe an indigenous woman from there? Or maybe did one of his adult sons have an illegitimate child? And Peggy didn't know. She's just like, who the fuck is John Sage? And why is he getting an inheritance? Like, who is this? So she's just like, who did I even marry? So he died in 1801. By autumn 1802, she had reduced expenses drastically by auctioning off her furniture, silver, and other valuable possessions. She rented out their townhouse. She lived in a much smaller place, and her two older sons, who had finished their education and were in the military now, donated their pensions to help finance the education of their younger siblings. So she was like, should I just go live a quiet life in the countryside? But she's like, no, I'm a city girl. Like I need to be around people, like museums, art galleries, parties. Like that's who I am. That's what I want. Her father was like, you could return to Philadelphia. But she's like, I'd rather not see like effigy parades of my husband and Satan. So I'll stay here in London. And much to her credit, through all of her actions, she managed to pay off her husband's debts. She believed that would help restore his honor, which, I mean, honestly, Peggy, I love you, but like nothing ever could. But I'm just impressed with the paying off of the debts. Good for her. Like being a woman who couldn't work, she just found a way to make it happen. She also intended to use, now that she had not debts, but like money, she wanted to help support his sister, Hannah. She wrote a letter to Hannah, plain dressed Hannah, to be like, you know, women supporting women. Like, I want to help you out. And she did. But she was now very ill, Peggy, with an abdominal tumor. She became bedridden. She was relying on opium as a painkiller. She wrote to her sister at this time, quote, I do not suffer my spirits to overcome me. I have much to be thankful for, most particularly for the very uncommon attention and kindness that I hourly experience from my numerous friends. I have the best advice that London can afford, and I'm constantly attended by two of the most eminent physicians. And then she died August 24th, 1804, aged 44. She was buried with her husband, and actually their daughter, Sophia, died as a young person as well. And she's also buried there at the same church, St. Mary's Church in Battersea, on August 25th, 1804. And at that church, so much, much, much later, so like 200 years later, an admirer of Benedict Arnold. For these people are out there, and I presume they have not made it this long in this podcast if they wanted to listen to it. A Benedict Arnold admirer donated new stained glass windows to that church in honor of Benedict Arnold, Peggy, and their daughter Sophia. So it's like stained glass windows showing like images of them as people. In 2004, another Benedict admirer donated a new memorial plaque to replace an earlier one. And this is in the basement of the church. The book I read said, like, so if you go there in the basement near the daycare center, there is a plaque to Benedict Arnold and Peggy Shippen and their daughter, Sophia. And I forgot to say earlier, but when they were in London, they were seen to be visiting John Andre's tomb in Westminster Abbey as well. So they paid their respects to their cool friend as well. So, Peggy Shippen, time to get into some scoring stuff. And we're going to score her on the Fredegan Memorial Scandaliciousness scale, as well as we're going to connect her to Marie Antoinette in ways you might be able to predict for this one. I don't know. So, and I do think that this story has a bit Marie Antoinette vibes as well, of just sort of like a young person who's just sort of like partying and likes her female friends, and then just kind of gets caught up in this, like has a horrible husband and is caught up in some wild international world events. So the first category on our scale is scandaliciousness. And I was thinking about this because she was a spy in the American Revolution. Like her husband, like we're not scoring Benedict Arnold, thank God. But so the people of Philadelphia found her pretty scandalous. Well, actually, at the beginning, the Quakers found her scandalous for her tits out dresses and for attending the Marchinista and stuff. But ultimately, she was, for most of her life, she was just like a stand by her man, like having children, like living as best she could, just sort of like a respectable life. But the scandal of her like being a spy, the reaction of the people in Philadelphia, it's I'm going to say for scandaliciousness, I'm going to give her a 6 because she was a spy who was run out of town for being a spy. And I mean, spy shit, invisible ink, ciphered letters, like that stuff's cool. For scheminess, I think she gets a high score for scheminess, both for her era. Of the various people in this, none of them were good spies, but I think she was at least a better spy than Benedict Arnold. But I'm going to say the scheminess of like how she reconciled the finances, like as a woman in 1801, like the way that she was really hands-on with all of that. Scheminess, we also often look at like the resiliency, like how people are able to pivot given life circumstances. And God knows she did that as well. Like whenever she, like she was so loyal to her man and she kept trying to fix his reputation and like she had strategies for that. And she was a lot of those strategies were just kind of like using her emotional and social skills and things. I think she gets a pretty high score for scheminess. I'm going to say like an 8 for scheminess. Significance, I mean, I'm just going to check my score again, but she's at this point, if you're like, why do the numbers keep changing? It's because the survey is still live as I'm recording this. But yeah, 22% of Americans, only 22% of the 300 people who answered the survey have heard of her. Like, I don't think she's super famous. Benedict Arnold, her husband, 87.8% of people have heard of him. Like, her significance, I think, to me, partially is sort of like emblematic of sort of like a wife who, and we haven't had a lot of stories like this on the podcast, who she kind of like lived up to the standard of what society expected of a woman to be. It's just she was in these various extreme situations because of what her husband was doing. But like she did, so many women in history were married to men and kind of had to put up with stuff, or just sort of like within those constraints had to find ways to make themselves happy. And she did, like she had her friends and she liked going to parties, like she had a nice time. But significance, I think it's pretty low for her, frankly. And that's the whole thing, like well-behaved women don't make history or whatever. Not that she was especially, I guess she was well-behaved for most of her post-marriage life. But it's just like she kind of did what was expected of her, and that's not necessarily significant, which doesn't mean the things that she did weren't worthwhile or weren't important. It's just in the grand scheme of things. Her significance, I'm going to say like 2, because at least, you know what, there's other people in this survey that less Americans have heard of. So she has been heard of by 22.4% of a survey sample of 300 Americans. And there's other people less famous. So, the sexism bonus, how much did sexism get in her way? And I don't think that was really an issue she had to face to very much extent. Like I think she found ways to live within the context she was in. Like she, as a young belle, she was just kind of like, okay, I'm valued for this and this and this. Great. Like I'm going to use that as currency. I'm going to become the most popular. Like her father, she was well educated. So, her education didn't suffer because of her gender. She learned about politics and stuff. I think if she had lived in a society where women were able to do more stuff than just like constantly be pregnant and raise the children of dirtbag husbands, maybe she would have been able to thrive in a different way. But I think she found a way for herself to do the best she could within the society that she was in. I mean, I don't know, like she was married off when she was 17, but like she wanted to be, because that's kind of how she saw a way to sort of improve. It's not that there's not sexism there. I just don't think it affected her very profoundly. So I'm going to give her a 3 for sexism. This is going to be a low score. No hate, but we end these episodes with these scores, and this is what it is. Her score is a 19. So, which gets her in the neighborhood of the Marys, like Mary Queen of Scots' pals, the 4 women all called Mary. They have a collective score of 18, and I think having Peggy Shippen in that area with a 19 makes sense, because these are kind of like women who they did what was expected and wanted of women at this time, and we know their names, but not a lot more about them. And so, like, they're on the scale. They're on the scale. It's just, not any higher up than that. I think this is suitable for her. And the other thing we're doing this season is Nothing But Net, a special new segment to see how do we connect the story to this season's ultimate heroine, Marie Antoinette, and the French Revolution. So I did mention that Benedict Arnold did run into some people leaving the French Revolution, and they also hung out with Marquis de Lafayette. So I was like, is that going to be her connection? No. Her connection is actually quite direct, because she met Queen Charlotte from Queen Charlotte, Bridgerton story, who, they directly knew each other. Queen Charlotte liked her. Queen Charlotte gave her a pension. Like, these two had dealings with each other and knew each other. And Queen Charlotte was pen pals with Marie Antoinette. So that's a pretty direct connection, actually. So Peggy to Queen Charlotte to Marie Antoinette is 2 degrees of separation. Is how close Peggy Shippen was from Marie Antoinette. So that is the end of the saga of Peggy Shippen, and that makes, if you count Peggy, which is short for Margaret, and if you count her along with Peg Plunkett, the various Marguerites and Margets, that makes 9 over the course of this podcast that has been around since 2019. And we've done, I don't even know how many people, 100 something, 9 Margarets. You might think, is that the most? I was thinking, is that the most of any name we've had? I feel like it was in the Women Trapped in Towers season. Just, it seemingly person after person just happened to be named Margaret. But in fact, Mary or Marie is the most populous name with 10. Margaret is creeping up there. But I will say, I counted the 4 Marys, Mary Queen of Scots, Ladies in Waiting. I just counted that as 1 Mary. So technically it's 13 Marys. Anyway, this is Vulgar History. As I mentioned at the top of the show, big exciting news. I'm going on an international research trip, but there will be time during that trip to do the first ever Vulgar History meetups. So I'm going to be in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I'll be available for meetup on Wednesday, August 21st, and I'm going to be in London, England, Wednesday, August 28th. And so the details are TBD, but if you want to RSVP for this and get updates about when I figure out where we're going to meet and what we're going to do, I mean, it's probably going to be walking around, looking at some oldie-timey things in some park somewhere in both cities. But go to vulgarhistory.com/meetup, and I'll put you on the list to know what we're doing and when and where. And also, if you're not in or near those places, but you want to know all the stuff that I'm experiencing during this research trip, which, I mean, side note, is my first time leaving Canada in 10 years. And 10 years ago, what I did was I just went to the US for a weekend. So it's my first time leaving the continent of North America in 15 years. So it's a pretty big deal for me personally. I'm going to be seeing so many things that I've talked about on the podcast. I am quivering with excitement, and I'm going to be sharing a lot of the stuff that I see. You can follow along. I'll be putting my photos, videos, and more at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, which is free. Like I'm going to be putting all these things up for free. So you can follow me there. It'll be sort of like a little blog. That's why I'm putting it there, just so I can have sort of like long essay type things. And then also I'll be putting some stuff in my Instagram stories, which is at Vulgar History Pod on Instagram. But speaking of both, I mean, you can follow me on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. And you can also follow me on Patreon. So patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. If you follow me just for free, like you can just go there and just sign up and say like, I want to be a free follower, whatever. Then you see all the stuff that I post there, like my trip pictures and videos and things. And then if you bump it up a notch, if you pledge at least $1 or more a month, and I think that's $1 US or potentially $1 Canadian. So I think in the EU, that might be like 50 cents. I don't know. I haven't been on my trip yet. I don't know conversions. But for $1 a month, you can get early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History. And you can listen to those. You don't have to listen to them in Patreon. You can just attach that to your regular, where you listen to your podcast, Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever. If you pledge $5 or more a month, you get access to bonus episodes of Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk about costume dramas with Alison Epstein and Lana Johnson, as well as episodes of The After Show, where I take it out to the after show with some of the guests when we just have so much to talk about. And also So This Asshole about some gross men from history. And I also want to mention the jewelry brand I will be wearing on my trip, Common Era Jewelry, which is our brand partner. So this is a beautiful small business, woman-owned business, and they make beautiful jewelry inspired by women from history and / mythology, like Roman mythology, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, and also history. The designs are all about women. They have a whole collection that's called the Difficult Women Collection, which talks about women who are historically kind of misinterpreted, misunderstood. Like we would call them tits out women. Tori from Common Era calls them difficult women. We're talking about like Agrippina, Anne Boleyn is there, Cleopatra is there. When we're talking about mythology, Medusa, just like Hecate, just like amazing women, badasses to wear on your neck or on your finger, because there's also rings. Anyway, Vulgar History listeners always get 15% off all items from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. And if you want to get some Vulgar History merch, such like I will be wearing on my trip, I was thinking when I have the meetups, how will people know who is me when we're having the meetup? And I'm like, oh, we're Vulgar History t-shirt. And then people know that's me. So I'm planning to wear the Peg Plunkett t-shirt. That's how you know it's me. Anyway, you can get your own Vulgar History merch. Go to vulgarhistory.com/store. That takes you to our TeePublic page. And you can get the beautiful designs that I have commissioned and paid artists to draw. I just want to let you know they're not done by AI or anything. They're like real human people who I have paid, who are talented artists, members of the Tits Out Brigade. You can get all those gorgeous designs. You can get on a t-shirt, on a magnet, on a sticker, on a pin, on like a phone case, like all different things wherever you want to flaunt your extremely niche interest in this podcast. And yeah, vulgarhistory.com/store takes to the TeePublic store, which is great if you're in the US. If you're outside the US, I recommend the Redbubble store. All the same stuff is there and the same deal. Just find the design you like, put it on whatever thing you want. That's vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And you can get in touch with me using the form on the website, which is vulgarhistory.com. I think it says like contact me or something. So if you have, honestly, if you're from Philadelphia, like if Peggy Shippen is your girl, like let me know. I don't know, like what do you know about Peggy Shippen when you grow up there? Like, or if you're from England, like did you know about John Andre and his like tomb? And if you're from New Brunswick, are you just excited that I talked about you for the first time ever? Anyway, you can get in touch with me about whatever at vulgarhistory.com. Just go to the little contact form or send me a DM on Instagram where I am at vulgarhistorypod. Next week, we're continuing our American history sojourn. We're going to have a lot more guest appearances by the main characters of the musical Hamilton as we take a look at another person who was at one point president of the United States, and some of the women who he was terrible to. So that's what's coming up next week. Until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History Show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Lauro, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.